controversial Netflix show called Alexander Making of a God has sparked debate across the world and left many questioning. Was Alexander the Great really a homosexual? Released on 31st of January 2024, Alexander the Making of a God takes you through different stages of Alexander's conquests. In the very first episode, the show portrays Hephaestion, Alexander the Great's childhood friend, as his lover. This has sparked debates across the world, many coming from Greek officials and public. In this video, we dive headfirst into the controversy. We will first understand the history of the claim and later go through the evidence for and against the argument and try to understand and come up with a logical conclusion. The idea that Alexander the Great might have been gay is not a recent one. The first notable depiction of Alexander as having same-sex relationships in a movie was in the 2004 film Alexander, directed by Oliver Stone. But where did the idea originate from? Historians and archaeologists use a variety of sources to speculate on the past. These speculations are often based on ancient sources such as the writings of Arrian, Plutarch, and Quintus Curtius Rufus and others. Although none of these sources directly label Alexander as gay, homosexual, or bisexual, there is always a bit of indirect indication, especially when it comes to deep friendship between Alexander and Hephaestion. A number of different sources are used to build upon this idea of Alexander being homosexual. Let's start with the most obvious one, his relation with Hephaestion. In Alexander's biography written by Arrian of Nicomedia, Arrian writes,
"He flung himself on the body of his friend and lay there nearly all day long in tears and refused to be parted from him until he was dragged away by force by his companions."
The friend being referred to here is Hephaestion. Upon Hephaestion's death, Alexander reportedly dragged himself over Hephaestion's corpse, refused food, cut his hair, and organized an extravagant funeral. According to Plutarch, Alexander spent 10,000 talents on the funeral and tomb for Hephaestion. For context, that's roughly $200 million in today's currency. Those who back the idea also refer to the cultural context of ancient Greece, where same-sex relationships were common. Pederasty was a socially acknowledged romantic relationship between an older male, called the Erastes, meaning an adult male who desires a younger male. And this younger male was referred to as the eromenos, meaning being passionately desired. Finally, another argument that is put forth brings the art of that time into question. Depictions of Alexander in ancient art and literature often suggest a romantic correlation with other males. Now, this is questionable, which leads us to why these arguments might be a little problematic. And here's where it gets really interesting. If you've made it this far, please make sure to subscribe and leave a like, as it helps with the algorithm and will also encourage me to create more of such videos. All right, back to it. After doing some basic math, this is what I came up with. These are the famous writers who can be considered quote-unquote sources of Alexander the Great's life. Now, this is the difference in years between the death of Alexander and their biographies of him. Arrian of Nicomedia, 4 centuries. Diodorus Siculus, 2 to 2.5 centuries. Quintus Curtius Rufus, 4 to 4.5 centuries. Plutarch, 3.5 centuries. And finally, Marcus Junianus Justinus, 5 to 6 centuries. You see where I'm going with this? This suddenly brings up a number of different questions to mind. Maybe they were exaggerating, maybe they were biased, maybe they wanted their biography to stand out so they added some controversy. But it's also important to mention here that not all of these biographies suggest that Alexander was a homosexual. This disparity of thought also contradicts the belief in question. Secondly, Alexander the Great was married 3 times to Roxana of Bactria, Statira sect of Persia, and Parysatis II of Persia, and had at least 2 children. This suggests he had sexual relationships with women. Now, I get what you're thinking.
So, since he was a king, he had to produce an heir, which might be why he got involved with women.
Or
Okay, he wasn't a homosexual. He might be bisexual.
Now, let's answer these one at a time. If he had to produce an heir, one wife would have been enough. But Alexander not only married thrice, he also had a number of mistresses and reportedly one son from a mistress. As far as him being bisexual is concerned, we can rule out pederasty, which focuses on an older man desiring a younger man. In Alexander's case, none of his reported partners had a considerable age difference. Sure, same-sex relationships might have been a thing in ancient Greece, but if something is prevalent in an era, it doesn't mean that everyone was part of it. Here's what I mean by that. Assume someone in the year 2450 is writing about how homosexuality was part of the Western society in 2024. That wouldn't automatically suggest that everyone in the West somehow engaged in the same practices. Whether or not Alexander was homosexual is up for debate. But I will leave you with a question here. Given that there is no concrete evidence here to support either argument, do you believe it's nothing and should be taken lightly? Or you think making such historical assumptions or errors is becoming a trend with Netflix? Let me know in the comments down below.